Welcome to another segment of Live from Forum 2022, powered by the National Association of Workforce Boards. I'm your host from Washington, D.C., Ron Painter, and anytime I get an economist to have a conversation, I am excited. I am really quite honored, David, that you would take time to sit down with me. My guest in this segment is David Altig, who is an executive vice president with the Federal Reserve Bank and out of the Atlanta Bank. So, David, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
Federal Reserve, we hear it like literally every day. We hear it in the news, we read it in the newspaper. What is the Federal, who owns the Federal Reserve? What is the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, well, you own it, I own it. The Federal Reserve's a public institution. We are chartered by Congress. We are giving our marching orders by Congress to do two things, to try to keep inflation in check and to ensure conditions are right so that we achieve maximum employment in the economy, and that's really our job.
That sounds pretty simple, David. I'm guessing it's a little harder to do that. How do you go about trying to understand, first of all, what's happening to each sides of that mandate
Well, the mechanical process is a lot of data and a lot of economists and professionals analyzing that data, but importantly, a big part of our job, particularly in the reserve banks, which are scattered all over the country, is to get our boots on the ground, to talk to people who are making real decisions in real time and have them tell us sort of where the economy is and where it's going. And so that's a huge part of the job. And then we collect ourselves, or at least our bosses do, in Washington, and they try to make the right sort of decision to engineer financial conditions so that we can achieve those two goals.
Do we talk ourselves, to an extent, David, do we talk ourselves into, I don't know necessarily inflation, but do we talk ourselves into recessions? Do we talk ourselves into recovery?
Yeah, I actually think it's more substantive than that. But perceptions are often reality, and one of the big concerns, and this has been expressed by many of the principals kind of making monetary policy now, is that when we go through a period like we've been through now, where the rate of inflation is much higher than what we've been accustomed to over several decades now, we don't want that to get embedded into people's psychologies, because they can be kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. So it's important that basically we in the Federal Reserve have the credibility to convince people that we're going to make the right decisions and get this on track.
And that talking ourselves into it again would work on both sides. If I'm running a company, I'm going to talk myself into maybe I better bump that price a little bit.
That's absolutely right.
And if I'm the consumer, I'm going to think, hey, my wages aren't going to go too far in a couple of months. What's my behavior look like when I think that way?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so what happens is, so there's an old-fashioned term we had for this, which was the wage price spiral, where everyone thinks inflation is coming and it's going to stay, and therefore they begin to actually embed it into their deals.
Okay.
Whatever they might be, whether it's
just the anticipation of that.
Is whether it's a kind of a labor wage deal or whether it's a contract between suppliers. Once that happens, then it really does become something like a potential self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's certainly not where we want to be.
So how does that, I don't know if it stops, but how does that slow down? How do we start to come back to where we have greater confidence of the, I guess, price stability?
Yeah, well, in truth, we haven't been through this very often in our history. The last time where we really saw sort of this dynamic where inflation was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy was the 70s.
Okay.
And it ended when Paul Volcker came around and said, you know what, no matter what, this is going to come to an end. Now, it was not seamless and it was not painless. So that's our best approach, is to not get into that situation.
So does the So action on the part of the Federal Reserve can trigger that slowdown, or you can signal that the slowdown?
Well, I mean, if you take the current circumstances, I think the strategy is, and of course I don't completely speak for the Federal Reserve, but I can say a little bit about the way we think about it in Atlanta in any event, which is the strategy really is to let what we think are underlying structural problems that are, supply chain problems and those sorts of things, which are creating our recent bout of inflation. That would include the Ukrainian situation, and let those play out without making them worse by having too much of our foot on the pedal. So one way to understand what the Fed is up to now with raising rates is to take our foot off the gas and not create a larger problem that we hope will sort of resolve itself.
Because when the interest rate goes up, then the activity slows. I'm
Yeah.
not as likely to take out
Well,
that
and-
loan. I'm not as likely to do a
Right.
capital expansion. So we're starting to
Right.
pull. Okay.
And conversely, if interest rate is too low, then there's more of that activity at a time when
Sure,
we just don't
right.
have the supply side to support it. And, so it's an attempt to sort of find neutral more than anything, I think, at the moment.
David, let's flip on the talk about the side on wages. You were very involved in what we refer to as the benefits cliff. Talk about the work that led up to the benefits cliff. What I guess intrigued you, or what were you all thinking when you started to say, hey, it's a real issue. How can we map it?
Yeah, it was really twofold. It in some ways started with some research that I was doing on tax policy, of all things.
Okay.
And I had run across some work of some old colleagues of mine who had embedded tax analysis in a way that included public assistance as part of the tax picture.
Okay.
So one way to think about public assistance payments is that they're negative taxes. So
Okay.
you want to think
All right.
broadly about taxes as the difference between what you pay to the government and what the government pays back to you. So most of us experience this in the form of Social Security. We pay into Social
Right.
Security, we get back Social Security, and these guys were thinking about that problem and thinking about it in a life cycle or lifetime context. But when I saw the work and eventually became engaged in it, I realized that what they were finding was that low-income individuals and people who are in jobs that paid low wages faced very high tax rates due to the phasing out of public assistance problems when they earn more money.
Relative to what some of us would experience, or just
Yeah,
period? It's a higher tax burden.
Both. So, for example, one of the things that you look at, if you look at wealth, the lowest 20%, the highest 20% of wealth holders, the difference between the next dollar you earn, what taxes you owe on that, between those two groups is not that large.
Okay.
And when you looked underneath the data, you would find that some low-income individuals were facing effective tax rates which were as high as 90%, 80%, which is a huge disincentive to work, obviously, and to gain skills. So at the same time, in my research division at the Atlanta Fed, we have our community development group who was working on workforce development. So we sort of looked at these two things together and say, well, wait a minute, we're trying to move people into careers that make them self-sufficient. And we've now discovered that the potential for facing very large disincentives to work is there through the nature of our public assistance program. And we just sort of took off from there with that insight.
Yeah, because there is in our lingo, people will say, oh, there's a parker. Somebody's parking, because they've realized that to take that promotion, to take that bump in wages, while it sounds like a good thing, when you put all things together, including childcare, and it's not such a great economic move.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those issues that everyone is sort of aware of, but quantifying it and coming up with a way to actually capture it in a workforce kind of context was one of the missing pieces, I think. And so we became very engaged in trying to provide the linkage there.
Is there such a thing as elasticity inelasticity of wages? I mean, is it by individual companies or by industry? Does it reach a point where we stop buying?
There very much is an elasticity. So elasticity is basically, one way to think about it is if I see a price change, how large is the impact on my behavior going to be? Or if I see a wage change, how likely is that to bring me into the workforce or make me work more hours? It is a really interesting question, particularly at the moment, because I have a colleague, I'll say a little bit about this tomorrow, who has noticed that the wage responsiveness, maybe that's the way we want to think about it, to work, differs quite a lot across generations.
I don't know about a seismic shift, but that's really going to be a big shift in the labor market, particularly because boomers have probably worked their way up. They are the majority of management, and it's a really different view of the world.
I would not rule out seismic at this point. I'll tell you that. And it is. That's a very interesting point you made, which is, so if I as a baby boomer try to extrapolate my reaction to a job proposition, it's not going to be the same thing.
It's not going to be the same thing. David, thanks for taking time. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks so much.
My guest has been David Altig, the Executive Vice President for the Federal Reserve in Atlanta, and we've been talking about the economy and wages and what the heck is going on at the moment. You've been tuned in to Forum 2022, powered by the National Association of Workforce Boards for NAWB. I'm Ron Painter. Thanks for joining us, and we'll hopefully connect soon.